Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome back to module number 3, your Advanced Photography module. Here's an interesting one that I didn't know myself, but did you know that Joel Nicholas Peterson, he holds the record for the largest ever photographic negative created. Peterson's photographs, they were created exposing giant lithographic film, which were developed using sprayers. Really interesting video about this online. He created, I think it was about 13 of these. Then he printed them, contact to the paper using a cyanotype process. So a cyanotype process is also a fascinating process in itself. It's something I did back in my college days. It's an old process from or in the Victorian era, and it produces these cyan or these blue type prints. A very interesting effect that you get from them. So you might check out Joel Nicholas Peterson, and indeed you might check out the cyanotype process as well. Very fascinating process too for creating photographs. So you're here with myself, your course educator, William Eames. I hope I find you all in good form after our previous lesson. It was a very tricky lesson, but the key to success is to show up to every single lesson. You will see an improvement in your photography every time you attend one of these lessons. Although you may not see it straight away, you definitely will as you progress on throughout the course. So we're on to lesson number 3. This lesson is all about filters. When we've talked about filters at various stages throughout this course, but we've never really had a chance to go in depth into them, and that's what we're going to have a look at. There are 3 primary filters anyway that we should be using. That's what we're going to have a look at in this lesson. Now, I know the previous lesson was a tricky one, metering modes, and in particular spot metering, very tricky technique to get down. But it will give you the ability to basically be able to approach any particular situation and know that you have the full range of tools available to you to get the correct exposure. However, there's still going to be issues where no matter what we do, there's going to be times when the light simply, we cannot capture it due to what's called dynamic range. And again, dynamic range is something we've spoken about before. But between this lesson and indeed the next lesson where we talk about high dynamic range, we're really going to gain a much deeper understanding of it. And if you ever look up camera reviews online, one thing that you will see mentioned quite often now is the dynamic range available in the camera's sensor. So we spoke about dynamic range before, and dynamic range is basically the camera's ability to be able to see the darkest parts of a photograph, the darkest parts of an image, and the lightest parts of an image at any given time. Now, in the next lesson, we're really going to dig much deeper into dynamic range, but we'll have a basic kind of understanding of it in this lesson. We saw this photograph before. Now, this is going back to our landscape photography lesson. We briefly spoke about it, that if we expose a scene like this using whatever our preferred metering mode is, so now we might be using spot metering. So we decide that we take our meter reading from the sky. We point our light meter at the sky and we take the correct reading. However, the foreground is underexposed. Now, no matter what we do, because of the difference between the darkness for the light, we just cannot get the correct exposure between two. Now, you might look at this photograph and you might think to yourself, well, that's okay, we can bring up this shadow detail afterwards. But the problem with doing that is that when you brighten up shadows in a digital photograph, you reveal noise. You begin to reveal noise. So this is something that we want to avoid. So I've taken my meter reading off the sky in this particular range. Okay, so I set my light meter to +1 using spot meter reading. I set my light meter to +1, and this is the histogram that I get for this particular photograph. Okay, so what we can see here is that we actually have very little details in the whites here. That's okay. That's absolutely fine. Okay, because there isn't really much white detail to be had there anyway, because this is a photograph that was taken at dusk as the sun was kind of going down. So we can see here we've got lots of highlight information. We have a little bit of mid-tone information, but the main thing here is we can see, if I just bring up my mouse here, that in this particular area, there's a dip. There is a U-shaped dip, and we know that when we see a U-shape in a histogram, that means that there is extreme contrast. There is very little information here at all. This is the point where the dynamic range, the difference between the dark part and the light part is simply too great. Cannot get the information there no matter what we do. So of course, then let's have a look at the opposite. So the next photograph here, we're going to be metering off the foreground. So we know that when we expose for the shadows, what's happening here is that all the bright parts of the photograph are now being overexposed. Okay, so we've taken my meter reading off the shadows in the foreground, and this is the histogram that I get in this particular case. So now I'm setting my meter reading to -1, because I know when I meter off this shadow area, to get the correct exposure, I need to bring my light meter to -1. And that everything else should then fall into place. But it can't fall into place because the dynamic range is too great. And what you can see here then, we have almost the inverse, the opposite of the previous histogram, where we now have a little bit of a peak here. There is some darkness here as well. There's a little bit more detail overall actually really in this photograph, except here in the skies, where we've got lots and lots of peaks. So we're losing information here, but we also have still got this dip here as well, where there's no information. So with this then, I know that whether I expose for the highlights, I'm going to lose some detail in the foreground. I know that if I expose for the shadows, I'm going to lose some details in the highlights. There isn't an in-between. I know there's no in-between here because I can see that there's a massive contrast in both of the photographs. So previously we looked at this, we said we could simply combine the two exposures to create a high dynamic range photograph. But we don't have to do that. If we want to try and capture this scene as it was at the time, we can introduce filters. And the first one we're going to have a look at are neutral density filters. These are the ones I get asked the most questions about. They can be complicated because there's so many different types of them out there. But mainly, people would associate neutral density filters with this type of photography, long exposure photography, particularly landscapes, long exposure landscape photography. But there's lots to understand when it comes to filters. And really, filters aren't just used, or neutral density filters, I should say, aren't just used for doing long exposures. They are also used to correct exposure. So what exactly are neutral density filters, or ND filters for short? Simply put, they're dark pieces of glass that will fit over your lens to increase the exposure time. Or also they're going to darken, overexpose or highlighted areas of your photograph. There's many different types of filters available. There's many different densities and available as well. And what I mean by densities is how dark the glass, how dark the filter is, how much it restricts the amount of light coming into the scene. Let's just have a quick look at filter density in action. So ND filters increase in darkness density, meaning that this increases the amount of light needed to get a correct exposure, and this is how you can get your longer exposures. So it reduces the amount of light coming into the scene, and that's measured in stops. The amount of stops that it reduces the light by is measured in two ways: by ND factors, neutral density 2, neutral density 4, neutral density 8, etc., are optical density, so 0.3, 0.6, 0.9, 1.2, etc. It just varies from brand to brand, so it's the exact same thing whether it's measured as ND2, ND4, or 0.3, 0.6. It just really depends on the brand that you're using. ND factors are more common. They're also a little bit easier, in my opinion, to understand as well. So let's have a look at this. So say, for example, in this particular scene, we add a neutral density filter, an ND2, or a 0.3 optical density filter. This will reduce the amount of light coming into the scene by 1 stop, or by half. So if we remember, a stop is either doubling or halving the amount of light coming into the scene. So it'll allow me to do a longer exposure. It'll increase the amount of time that I need to get a correct exposure by 1 stop. If I go up to an ND4 filter, this is a darker piece of glass. So this will increase the amount of time I needed by 2 stops. So it darkens my scene by 2 stops. Every time we move in density, we're adding another stop. We're increasing the amount of time we need by 1 more stop. So an ND8 is going to give us 3 stops of darkness, and then finally, in this case, an ND16 or 1.2 is going to give us 4 stops of darkness. Now this keeps going. It goes all the way up to a 10 stop difference. So there's a particular filter called a big stopper, which will allow you to really reduce the light dramatically so that you can actually decrease it by 10 stops of light, which is incredibly dark, meaning that you could do very, very long exposures. Okay, so it just keeps going and going. If you're new to ND filters, what I'd recommend is that you stick within this type of range to begin with, from ND2 to ND4, ND16 and so on, just so you get the grips of them. They're more commonly used. If you're starting out and you can only afford to get yourself 1 filter, I'd recommend looking at a neutral density 8 filter. It just gives you enough flexibility to do slightly longer exposures, without getting into kind of more complex territory. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as we progress on throughout the lesson. Now, there's lots and lots of different types available. So they come in a number of varieties of materials. There are your simple standard screw-on filters, and then there's adapter systems as well. So adapter systems look like this. You have an adapter ring that will attach to your camera. You have a filter holder, and then you can start attaching filters to the filter holder. The advantage with this is that it will allow you to stack filters. So in other words, you can increase density of your filters by adding more filters. The disadvantage of them, we'll have a look at it a little bit later, but they're not particularly great for very wide lenses. They cause heavy vignettes, and sometimes the materials that are used to make them are very, very cheap. So, it really depends on how much you're willing to spend on them. However, they're a much more affordable option if you want to get into this type of photography without spending a load of money to begin with. Now again, it's brand dependent. You can get adapter systems that are very complicated and very, very expensive. But Koken is a good place to start if you want to test out and get into the world of neutral density filters. We can, of course, get our standard screw-in filters as well. The disadvantage with these is that we can't really stack these in most cases. Some of them you will be able to stack them. You'll be able to screw on more filters over the top of them, but they get a little bit complicated then in terms of being able to try and focus scenes and so on. So typically these types of screw-in filters you'd use one at a time. So as I mentioned, adapter systems allow you to stack your filters to increase density. You can get much more expensive versions like this one here. Typically, Lee filters are the kind of top brand. They're seen as the best ones to go for, but you're going to spend a lot more money on them. But you can also get different materials as well. So you can get ones that are made of glass or ones that are made of plastic resin. Koken ones are typically made of plastic resin, so they're a little bit cheaper, but you do lose a little bit of image quality. You also get color casts from them as well. We'll speak about that a little bit later too. So glass ones, if you can afford them, are a much better option to go with. There's also what's known as variable filters too, like the Tiffin one that you can see here on screen at the moment. So a variable neutral density filter. These are a great option. Basically, they would allow you to increase or decrease the density simply by rotating the filter. However, they are much more expensive. So if you're after just one filter that kind of does it all, you'd be looking at a variable ND filter, but you are going to spend more money on them. But it'll allow you to increase and decrease the density simply by rotating the filter. So filters will allow us to increase the amount of time that we need to capture an exposure. But how can they help us overcome dynamic range? Well, there's a type of filter, a neutral density filter we can get called graduated filters. These are designed only to darken a part of the photograph at the top. These are primarily used in landscape photography to prevent overexposure in the sky. So they look a little bit like this. Basically, only one part of the filter is dark, and they're called graduated because they'll gradually ease off the darkness and kind of just come into clear glass then towards the bottom, so that it won't affect the exposure in the bottom part of the photograph. So you can get them as screw-on versions like you can see here, or again, as the kind of ones that we can use to stack when using a neutral density filter adapter system. Let's have a look at them in action. So here we have another scene here. We have a shutter speed of a 60th of a second, f16 aperture here, ISO of 100. So, you know, we're kind of photographing around the sweet spot. We have a reasonable shutter speed. We're metering for the mid-tones in the foreground here. Now, what we have here is a histogram that looks like this. Now, it's not terrible by any means at all. It's still a reasonable exposure, but there is a bit of overexposure, as we can see here, very much over on the right-hand side. You can see it here. It's very much this part of the clouds here in the photograph. Okay, so again, let's say we decide that we want to do the opposite and we take the same photograph, but in this case with the exact same settings, except we're metering for the midtones in the sky, and we are now have a shutter speed of 250th of a second. Now, what we can see here is that we have far more detail in the clouds, but we've of course lost detail in the foreground. So again, we have the opposite kind of scene. We have a lot of detail lost in the blacks parts of the photograph, the darkest areas, but then we have a lot of information, good information here along the rest of the photograph. So the ideal situation here is that we get the best of both worlds. So let's just bring them up here. This was our original exposure at a 60th of a second. This is our second exposure at 250th of a second. All the other settings are the same, and as you can see, the histograms are completely the opposite, more or less. So can you tell me what is the stop difference between these two scenes? So all the other settings are the same except for the shutter speed. So what is the difference in stops here between those two exposures? How many stops difference is there between the two shots? Okay, so if you said there's a 2-stop difference in exposure, you are absolutely correct. So in this particular scene, what I want to do is I want to reduce the exposure in the sky by 2 stops. So if I want to reduce the exposure in the sky by 2 stops, that'll give me the correct exposure for the sky, and it'll allow me to maintain all the detail in the foreground as well. So in this case, I want to use a graduated filter of ND4. An ND4 graduated filter would allow me to reduce the exposure by 2 stops. So just to give you an idea, if we were to visualize it now, it would be like putting a filter only over this part of the photograph. So this is just an exaggeration, just to give you an idea of how it looks. You can very clearly see the edge of the filter. You know, this is how much we're going to darken the exposure by 2 stops to give me the correct exposure for the overall scene. So the final result then is this photograph here, where I have my shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. I have an f16 ISO 100, but now I have a graduated filter, an ND filter applied, because it reduces the exposure by 2 stops at the top, And I now have a far more balanced histogram overall, giving me much more tonal quality, much more tonal value throughout the entire scene. So graduated filters, excellent for landscape photography, for specifically really preventing overexposure in the sky. Now there's different types of filter edges as well. So we can get what are called hard edge and soft edges too. So the hard edge ones here, you can see at the top, there's a very definite line going right across the edges here with the separation between the top part and the bottom part of the filter. The soft edge will give you a more gradual kind of separation between the dark part and the light part, so that you don't get such a defined hard line between the two of them. Reality, soft edge filters are probably going to be much more versatile than a hard edge filter. Hard edge filters you'd be using in kind of much more flat landscapes, areas where there's a very clear separation between your sky and your ground. A kind of soft edge graduated filter be tricky for those trickier terrains where the definition between the sky and the ground is less so. Now there is also a couple of variations on these graduated filters. So we can also get reverse filters. So they can come with the darker part found in the center of the filter and the lighter part at the top. And they do have a very specific purpose. Does anybody want to tell me what it is? So a reverse filter, reverse graduated filter, the lighter part is at the top and it gets much denser in the middle. So the specific purpose that they're used for is very much for sunsets, for capturing sunsets. So they're used for getting more accurate exposure in this very specific scenario, just as the sun is about to set and go over the horizon. So what we can see basically is, this is essentially what the camera would see. The lighter part is here at the top and it gets much more dense as we move down to the middle of the photograph, typically at the point where the sun is just about to set. Now you could probably find other purposes that you could use these for as well, but very much designed for trying to ensure that we get correct exposures during sunsets. Now, so with full neutral density filters, basically these are filters that are going to uncover the entire scene. They'll darken the entire scene. And they're used for increasing exposure times, primarily in brighter situations. So if we want to get a long exposure during daylight hours or at dusk, like in this particular photograph here, you get that lovely silky smooth water effect. Or you can also use them at night as well if you want to get an even longer exposure time. But primarily they're used to get long exposures during daylight situations. Let's have a look at an example. So we think back to our very first module, module 1, and we learned the basics of shutter speed. One of the first images I show is a waterfall, with the flowing water captured to illustrate how shutter speed changes the capturing of motion in a scene. Now, what this usually leads to is lots of students going out and trying to do a longer exposure, something like a waterfall like this, to capture that movement. And what they learn very, very quickly is that it's very difficult to increase exposure time, to do a longer exposure in daylight situations without the image becoming overexposed. So let's look at this scene here. We've got a quarter of a second. It's certainly too slow for us to hand hold the camera in this case, so we'd want to be using a tripod. We've closed our aperture down as much as possible, to reduce the amount of light coming in, and indeed using the lowest ISO available to us as well, so that we can try to minimize the overexposure as much as possible. However, the scene is still 2 stops overexposed. I can tell this from reviewing the histogram, or indeed from doing tests at other shutter speeds to see when the correct exposure happens and measuring them from there. So in this case, very straightforward, we add an ND4 filter, a neutral density 4 filter again, because that will reduce the amount of light coming in by 2 stops. thus giving me now the correct exposure for the scene and allowing me to do a long exposure here to capture that flowing water and to get that lovely silky water effect. So full neutral density filters a little bit more straightforward compared to graduated filters, really, because we're just using them to increase the overall exposure time in a scene. Now, as I mentioned earlier as well, just to talk about them very, very briefly, it is possible to get variable ND filters, and these will rotate to allow us to change the densities without the need to change the filter. They are more expensive, but are a lot more convenient. So, for example, we could be photographing a scene like this. We're at f11, we have a 2-second exposure, our ISO is at 100, and we're at ND4. Now we're looking at it, we review the scene, we decide that we want to add even more movement, even more motion to the scene. So we can simply rotate the filter, same exposure settings, but we now have a 4-second exposure. So our aperture, our ISO exposure settings are the same, but we've now increased it to 4 seconds because we're now using ND8. So variable ND filter, very, very useful, very, very convenient. But as I said, they are more expensive, so do be prepared to pay a little bit extra for that convenience. Now, unfortunately, ND filters, they're not without their issues as well. So there are a few things that you need to consider when it comes to ND filters. One of the biggest problems I find with neutral density filters is that if you are using a cheaper brand, or a better value brand, I should really be saying, is that they are going to cause a color cast. Like this image here, you can see we've got a very magenta tint to the photograph. Sometimes you'll get a green cast as well. This will need correction in post-production. Certainly isn't the end of the world by any means, but do be aware of it. Wide lenses as well can suffer from very heavy vignetting at the edges. If you happen to be using the incorrect adapter with an incorrect lens, you also may see the actual adapter itself in the edges of the photograph. Darker densities can be very, very hard to focus. It can be very difficult to actually see through just the focus and the actual scene. So that is something that you're going to need to take care with as well. Do look after them. I can't tell you how many filters I went through from simply not looking after them correctly, not putting them back into their cases. They usually come with a little case, so always put them back in and look after them properly. And you will, unfortunately, again, get what you pay for. So you do lose a little bit of image quality, a little bit of sharpness as the light is coming through cheaper filters too. But don't let that put you off. Don't rush out and buy the most expensive filter. These are issues that you can live with, and there are also issues that can be corrected as well. So as I recommended earlier on in the lesson, look to the Koken brand or a similar brand. If you're beginning with neutral density filters, there's no need to spend hundreds of euro on filters if you've never used them before, because you might find that you use them for a little while and then decide not to use them ever again. So very often photographers will buy something that they think is incredible and they're like, oh, this is really cool, I want to try that type of photography. They try it out and then they don't ever use that piece of equipment again. So you're better off starting cheap and then building up slowly if you decide that this is something that you have a really great interest in and that you want to pursue. Now, moving away from neutral density filters onto a very different type of filter that often gets very confused with neutral density filters are polarizing filters. So polarizing filter is a filter that I would recommend that every photographer should have for lots and lots of different reasons that we'll have a look at now. First of all, what are polarizing filters? Well, basically, these are specifically adapted glass that when they're turned at an angle to a light source, primarily the sun, they'll reduce glare from reflected surfaces and they will darken skies. By filtering out basically extra reflected light, they will actually increase color vividness in a scene. They give the effect of increasing contrast. And this is something that you'll usually very often see when you get these really kind of dense blue skies. But they're also fantastic because they'll allow you to photograph through glass. So if you're trying to photograph through glass without reflections, polarizing filter will allow you to do that. And it'll also help to reduce reflections if you're trying to photograph through water or anything that has a reflective surface. So just to give you an idea, so if we're photographing on a very, very sunny, bright day, like in this particular situation, what's actually happening is that there's a lot of light being reflected off, the objects here, off the particular, the foliage here. Okay, so there's a lot of light being reflected here. By using a polarizer, we can reduce the amount of reflection here to bring out the vividness of the colors. I mean, have a look here at the details. Look at example for the leaf detail here. And look at it then compared to the next photograph in the same area. You can see that there's no light being reflected off, or no glare, I should say, really. There is light being reflected off it, but there's no glare being reflected off it, giving us much more detail. It also darkens the sky. It'll also increase, like if you think about when you wear sunglasses, it'll increase the kind of polarization there in the sky as well, giving darker, denser skies. It'll reduce reflections, so as we can see here, not the best quality photograph at all, but just to give you an idea, if we use a polarizing filter, is that we can rotate it, that'll actually just get rid of the reflection on water as well, and the same effect will happen with glass. So they're incredibly useful for this particular reason. So they're more effective in bright sunlight, but they can be used pretty much any time, any stage of the day, to reduce any glare coming off any surface. And that is any surface. So, if you're photographing, say, on the street, like I would use a polarizing filter for street photography, because a lot of light is actually reflected and a lot of glare does come off concrete as well. Surprisingly, you would be surprised if you saw comparisons. So it is useful for reducing the glare. To get the maximizing the angle of polarization from the sun, you want to try and photograph in a perpendicular way depending on the angle of the sun. So when you say perpendicular, so if you think about parallel is when you have two things going side by side. Perpendicular is when you're almost at a right angle of the object. So for example, if the sun is right above us, we want to be photographing basically in any of these directions, a right angle, a perpendicular from the sun. Similarly here, if the sun is at a lower angle, our angle is going to be much narrower in terms of the effect of polarization. Now, that's to maximize it. So, it will depend on the lighting situation that you are in, and maybe you don't want to maximize that polarization effect for whatever reason. So you are going to be tweaking this as you go along and as you use the filter. So the filter is going to depend on the angle that you're photographing at, and it's also going to depend on the effect, the rotation that you have on the filter. So polarizing filters, when they're attached to your lens, they actually rotate separately, independent of the lens, and you'll actually see the image getting darker and brighter as you rotate the filter. So you've got that factor to take into account, as well as the angle of the light source, the angle of the sun, when you're getting that polarizing effect. I mean, the best thing to do really is, if you get your hands on one, it's just simply a case of practicing and searching for the correct angle. But a polarized photograph, a correctly polarized photograph, should look something like this. We have a nice balanced exposure, we have even tones right across the photograph, lots of details, we have a good deep sky without it being too dark, and most importantly, we have no glare coming off the surfaces at all. So as you can see here in this scene, particularly off the concrete here, This is something that can reflect a huge amount of light, but the polarizing effect has done a really good job here of reducing that glare, giving us a photograph full of detail, but lots of shadows, lots of tonal range. An over-polarized photograph is a photograph that's going to look like this, where we have a sky that's far too dense. And as you can see here, it doesn't cover the entire scene. So what might be a problem here as well is that the lens is too wide. Now this is also unfortunately an issue with polarizing filters, is that if your lens is too wide, you're not going to get the entire polarizing effect across the entire scene. Okay, so it's either a case that we have rotated the filter too much, creating too dense a photograph. We might have the lens or the angle might be too much here as well, giving us a photograph that's too dense, or the lens might be too wide in this case as well. But we can see here that it just doesn't look right. The sky just looks far too dark for this type of scene, and this is just an over polarized photograph. Just a couple of other things to be aware of with polarizing filters. So unfortunately, they do come with a few issues themselves. So they can reduce exposure time too. So while not in the same scale as neutral density filters, they can still reduce the amount of light coming into a scene, as they are dark pieces of glass. They are one of the more expensive filter types out there as well. Working out the angles to find the polarizing effect can be a little bit tedious too. And because the filters rotate themselves, if you're trying to use manual focus, it can be a little bit frustrating as well. You can't really use them for panoramic photography at all, because the polarizing effect is going to change as you're moving across the scene, and they can only cover a part of an exposure with a wide angle lens. It might seem like a little ironic that you can actually get them for wide angle lenses, given the fact that they're not that effective with them, but they are available for very wide angle lenses. But really, kind of mid-range lenses, you're going to get the best effect from them. I would be saying from anywhere from about 24 millimeters upwards, you should be okay. But anything wider than that is when you're kind of going to get into issues with the polarizing effect not covering the entire scene. Now, for the final filter to have a look at quickly, probably one that we're all very, very familiar with, but they are just worth talking about briefly, are ultraviolet filters, UV filters. Now, UV filters, they really don't have a huge amount of use anymore. They were primarily used for film photography. So film photography had an issue with ultraviolet light. UV light coming into the camera could cause haziness on a film photograph. Now, our digital cameras are much more advanced, so they can deal with this haziness much more effectively. So it's a lot less an issue in digital cameras, but it's certainly an issue when it comes to film photography. Now, we use UV filters nowadays really as simply a case for protecting the lens. They can help to reduce haziness in a scene. So if you're in a scene where it's like an image like this, where you're photographing something very far away, it's maybe a little bit foggy, a little bit hazy, maybe there's a lot of pollution that you're trying to photograph, they can help to bring back a little bit of contrast in a scene. But primarily, as I've mentioned, is that you want to use a UV filter to protect the front lens element. Don't say it'll never happen to you. When I worked in camera shops, when I was cutting my teeth as a photographer, I can't tell you how often people came in with us having to remove broken UV filters. The lenses were always fine, but the UV filter itself was smashed. That's okay. It's a lot cheaper than replacing an actual lens. So if you don't have a UV filter on your lens, you may consider getting one on ASAP. If you've been annoyed at the camera shop pushing you to buy a UV filter, they're doing it for your own benefit. Absolutely, a UV filter is going to help you when it comes to protecting your lens. Now, the only issue that you may encounter when it comes to a UV filter is that unfortunately they can cause lens glare and lens flare. Okay, so it can be a bit of an annoying issue, particularly with lower quality filters. Unfortunately, you can get this type of effect where if you're photographing in direct light, so again, I typically see this very often when I'm photographing at night and I'm using a UV filter, you'll get this kind of lens glare. So it's simply a case that you just have to remove the filter in that particular case. Or you can go with a higher quality filter and you won't get that effect. A good general rule for any filter is that coated filters are going to give you much better results. When you're purchasing a filter of any kind, if you can see reflection, if you can see yourself in the filter, if it's almost like a mirror, that means that it's going to reflect light when it comes to the time of exposure as well. Coated filters are going to cost more, but they will not impact the exposure. So as you can see very clearly in this image here, that the first filter here is not a coated filter. There's a load of light being reflected off of this, and this is just simply a standard UV filter here. This is the Hoya brand in particular. Actually, they're a very good brand to check out. They're a mid-range brand, so they're not too expensive, you know, and that their quality is good. But as you can see here, a lot of light being reflected off this particular filter. So you can imagine when you're taking your photograph, that's light that's being lost in the exposure. So you want to try and get a filter. You might not be able to afford one that's going to be as clear as this, but as clear as you can possibly get and as clear as you can possibly afford. So that's my final tip when it comes to looking at any particular type of filter. So that is the end of this lesson. I do hope that you enjoyed it and it gave you a good insight into different filters. Well, there are 3 primary filters: neutral density filters, polarizing filters, and UV filters. Of course, there is many more filters out there, but these are the ones that we are going to be using the majority of time as photographers. Any other filters out there, they're only adding effects. They're not really helping us to overcome exposure issues. Our next lesson is all about high dynamic range photography. We're going to have a look at auto exposure bracketing. We're going to have a look at how to prepare for HDR and then how and when to use HDR. What we're not going to do in the next lesson is actually combine the exposures. We're going to have a look at how to do that in module 4. But really, that's actually a very straightforward process. The key to successful high dynamic range photography is in the preparation. We'll also have an in-depth look at dynamic range itself. Like I said, we've looked at it now a lot. You're probably getting a little bit tired of it at this stage, but we're really going to have one final look at it so you fully understand it. And by fully understanding that, combined with everything else that we've looked at so far in this module, you will pretty much know everything that you need to know about exposure. So your challenge for this lesson, I would like you to take a long exposure during daylight hours. Now, don't worry if you don't have a neutral density filter. I'd still want you to do this to see what results you get. Doesn't matter if it's wrong, you know, it doesn't matter if it's completely overexposed. I want you to get familiar with the issues. I suppose I want you to get familiar with the exact point where your camera simply cannot get the correct exposure because too much light is coming in, and you'll be surprised at how quick that happens, at how quickly that you cannot use a long shutter speed to get the correct exposure happens during daylight hours, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Thank you for joining me for this lesson, and I'll talk to you all again very, very soon. Take care of yourselves until then. Bye-bye.